bad once you control breathing. All right.
In this video, I'm taking on another massive project and racing against the clock to build this one-of-a-kind sauna. Over the next hour, I build this entire unit from scratch, and then I take it out and try it in a winter wonderland. So for this build, I'm going to be building it inside my shop because working outside at this time of year absolutely sucks, as I learned on my tiny house. And I rent a shop with a big door, so I might as well use it. So to get started, I ordered this stack of clear cedar lumber, and this little bit of lumber cost over $10,000 Canadian, which is insane. But pretty much all the money I've ever made has come off of this YouTube channel, and I really want to keep investing that back into the videos and make cooler and cooler stuff, and obviously that's going to mean more and more expensive. But that way you guys get to see all the growth and progression too, from the $50 videos I started this channel with to what it is now and what it could be in the future. So this sauna is going to be its own standalone building, and the foundation for this is going to be a deck made out of 2x6s. So I just have some regular cedar 2x6, and I'm cutting these to length with my miter saw. And then I'm screwing together this main deck frame using some 3.5-inch deck screws. With the outer frame screwed together, I marked out the spacing for these inner joists and screwed them in with those same deck screws. By the way, I know there's a lot of people waiting for me to start the interior of my tiny house. It's just getting dark out at like 4 o'clock right now, and there's no lighting in there obviously, so it's almost impossible to build and more importantly film in there right now with such short days. But don't worry, I'll get back to the tiny house in March or April when it doesn't suck so much to live in Canada again. With most of the deck framed up, I lifted it up onto these 5x5 beams so that I can get a forklift under this once it's all done and I don't have a shop sauna. And then I took a measurement of both diagonals and made any adjustments that they were the exact same, so I know this frame is completely square. Then I cut up a bunch of 2x6 blocks just to go between all of these joists and give the frame a bunch more support. Now I actually made the outer frame of this deck about 3 inches shorter in each direction than its final size, and that's so that I can take some of these clear cedar 2x6s and cut them with some nice 45-degree miters and basically case around this regular cedar framing. Clear cedar is about 4 times the price of this regular cedar, so it makes sense to use regular wherever you can that's not visible, or in the whole thing if you don't mind the look of it. Then I just tacked these 2 pieces together at the miter using my 15-gauge nailer, and then tacked it into its position on the main frame. Then I used a couple 2.5-inch deck screws screwed in through the back every foot or so around the whole perimeter of the frame. With these screws screwed in through the back, it keeps the nice clean look of the clear cedar, and there's really no exposed fasteners. Now it's time to insulate the floor underneath where the sauna itself is actually going to be. So I have this rip jig for my circular saw, which I find is the easiest way to cut this up, and then I have this 2-inch thick R10 rigid foam insulation. I'd cut these pieces just about 1/8 of an inch oversized and then use a mallet to hammer these into place. And then after I had the first layer hit roughly into place, I used some window and door expanding foam as some adhesive, and then malleted in the second layer, giving this floor a total insulation of R20. I also use that same expanding foam just to fill the gaps at the top, and after it's set up for a couple hours, I'd use a good sharp knife just to cut this flush. Now I have this foil vapor barrier that's specifically made for saunas, and I'm just spreading this out over all the insulation just underneath where the actual building itself is going to sit. And I just used a staple gun to tack this into the floor joists. Then I used a long 1/4-inch drill bit just to drill some weep holes in each one of these sections, just so that any water or anything that goes through the floor can escape out these weep holes. Now I have this black landscaping fabric, and I'm just going around all the portions that I didn't cover with the vapor barrier, just to give this a clean black look under the deck and stop any weeds from coming through. And now it's time to actually start laying the deck, so I have these clear cedar deck boards, and I'm just cutting some nice 45-degree miters into them. Also, a good tip when cutting these miters is to make your mark on the outside edge of the board, and then I'll just start the cut a bit outside of this mark and inch up on it until I'm right on it, and then complete the cut. And that's the easiest way to get that exact measurement on the outside edge, at least the easiest way that I've found. You also want a good sharp 60-tooth blade in your miter saw, and that's going to save you a lot of sanding on these edges. To screw in these deck boards, I'm using this handy jig that actually screws the screws in through the side of the board so that they aren't overly visible from the top. Once all the other boards get set in place, you'll barely be able to see any of these screw holes. If you just want to build something fast, this isn't necessary at all, but if you're paying the price like I did to get all this clear cedar lumber that looks so pretty, it would be a shame to put a bunch of screws right in the face of it and ruin the whole look. Then I just started laying these interior boards. One more thing with the insulation is I actually set it down about an 1/8 inch or so from flush with the top of the floor joist just to let out any water and naturally air itself out. I also didn't like how the gap in the deck boards exposed this silver metallic vapor barrier, especially in the right light. So my solution to this was to use some high heat spray paint and just spray paint the edge of every board as it was laid down. And then when the next board is put in place, it's really just black in that gap. You would think this isn't a huge deal, but in the right light you could see this glittery effect between the deck boards, and when you're spending $30,000 on a build, I'm going to make it right. And then this last piece obviously wasn't going to be a full width deck board, so I just used my circular saw to rip this to width. And then I used an 1/8 inch round over bit in my palm router just to route this edge off to match the other side. One last thing before this deck's done is I actually only attach these outer boards on the inside edge so you wouldn't see the screws on the outside. So I'm using a 3/8 inch Forstner bit to countersink some holes, and then using some 2.5 inch deck screws to screw this outside edge down. And then I have this off-cut piece of this exact same board, so I'm taking it over to my drill press and using these 3/8 inch dowel cutting drill bits to drill a few dowels out of this board. Then you can just break the dowel out with a screwdriver, and then I fill up the hole with some wood glue. Pop the dowel into place and use any of the sawdust from drilling the hole just to fill in any imperfections. A couple hours later, I'll just come back with my multi-tool and take off the majority of the dowel. And then just sand this flush with some 120 grit, and then you can barely even see this. It's again just another way to preserve the look of this clear cedar and not have any exposed fasteners or anything else that's going to resemble knots. But that's the deck fully done. Now let's frame up some walls. So there's a lot of this video that overlaps with my last video of building the exterior of my tiny house. So I'm not going to go into a ton of technical detail on the framing of these walls. If you need that, you can watch my tiny house video and skip to about the 8-minute mark. So basically I just have my plan for each wall, and then I'm marking out the top and sill plate with the stud placement. And then just filling in all these studs. A couple things from the comments of the tiny house video. A lot of people said that the frame should be screwed together instead of nailed since it's a movable structure. In that video I just sunk 3 framing nails like this. But there was a lot of people saying the frame should be screwed together to withstand the forces of travel. I'm really not worried about it for the tiny house because it's not made to travel like a camper. It's only made to be moved when it has to be moved, so probably like a few times in its life. This sauna isn't a portable unit right now, but I do have plans for this to potentially be a mobile unit in the future, so I'm going to compromise and do 2 nails to tack these studs in place, and 1 screw to hold it a little more rigidly. Again though, this is probably overkill. Also, notice the sill plate of these walls is actually a cedar 2x4, and that's just so it holds up to the elements a little better because these walls are sitting on the deck, so the sill plate will probably take some moisture from time to time. Now before we lift these walls into place, I'm taking a good amount of time to level the deck. Once the deck is perfectly level, I can just level the walls once they're in place, and I don't have to square them based off the deck, and it just makes everything a lot easier. Next I set a line about 1 inch back from the edge of the deck with my chalk line, and this is just going to be the alignment line for the outer edge of the wall, and then used a little more expanding foam just as some sill insulation underneath the wall. Now we can start lifting the walls into place. With the wall aligned properly, I just tack it into the deck with some 3-inch deck screws for now. And I screwed each wall together using a deck screw every foot or so. I just had my brother help out for 20 minutes while I did this because these walls are pretty heavy. Once all 4 walls were up, I checked everything for level, and I actually had to shear them the one way a little bit. So I used a ratchet strap mounted at the top of the one wall and the bottom of the other just to pull it over, and then I could tack a 2x4 brace in place temporarily. And now everything's sitting nice and level, and that's only the end of day 2 of work on this. I just started this a few days after the tiny house video was released, which gave me just over 3 weeks and change to build this entire thing and get the video out before Christmas. So we'll see how I do. When I'm saying this right now, it's about the first week of December. Next, I'm just adding the second top plate to the 3 lower walls and overlapping the seams of the walls just to bind them together better. And now I'm going to anchor these walls into the frame of the deck, so I pre-drilled a hole down through the sill plate into one of the floor joists below the deck. And then I used this 3/8 inch by 5 inch lag bolt to bolt the walls securely down onto the foundation. I did this about every 2 to 3 feet around every wall, and every one of these bolts went down through the deck boards into the floor joists below, not just into the deck board. Now it's time to start on the rafters, and this is just going to be a single slope lean-to style roof, so these are pretty simple to frame up. First I'm making a template, and I just screwed this screw into the top plate just a little lower so that I can hang this rafter off the side, and then trace these cut edges at the top and bottom. Then I can take this board down and cut these lines with my circular saw. Any cuts I couldn't finish with the circular saw, like this bird's mouth here, I would just finish it up using a reciprocating saw. And for the end cut, I know the slope of the roof is 5 degrees, so I just made a 5-degree cut right where I needed it. Then I can take this template rafter up to check its fit. And the bird's mouth was sitting perfectly snug and both ends are level, so this is a good template. Now I can trace this on to a few more 2x6s and get the rest of the rafters cut up. To secure a rafter in place, I'd first just toenail it in with a deck screw just to hold it in place. And then I have these Simpson truss and rafter screw, and I'm just going to go in from the bottom side of the top plate right into the rafter to secure it in place. One of these at each end of the rafter is all you need. Now I have some good straight 12-foot long 2x6s that are going to be the header boards. So I just lifted one into place and started screwing it into the rafters. I'd use a scrap piece of 2x4 like this to just ride along the rafter I was working at, and then I would just push the header into place until it just touches this 2x4. So I left these boards overhanging quite a bit so that I could add in these additional rafters and complete the overhang of the roof. These rafters were cut using the same template, I just didn't have to cut in the bird's mouth. And with those screwed into place, I can just square off a line with that last rafter and then just cut off this overhang using my circular saw. One last thing, I cut up a bunch of 2x6 blocks and strategically added these throughout the framing of the roof just for some added structural support, as well as where I'm going to need to nail into. And that's all the major framing of this build done. Now it's time to sheet the roof, and to do that I'm using some 1/2-inch standard plywood, and I'm just using this track jig for my circular saw to cut these sheets to size. Then I'd screw in 2 of these scrap pieces of 2x4 onto the fascia board just so that this plywood wouldn't sink down any lower than the edge of the roof. And with everything nice and flush, I'd sink some 2-inch framing nails every 4 inches or so around the edges of all the sheets. I'd also keep some spare nails on hand all the time, just so that I could space these sheets around all the edges by about a nail width or 1/8 of an inch. It's really probably not super necessary for a roof this size, but it is proper practice to have every sheet spaced by 1/8 inch or so. Then I just started filling in the rest of the sheets. It's really nice working on something this size versus the tiny house, because sheeting the roof, for example, was a full day task with the tiny house, and it's about an hour or so doing this. As the last step, I would just use a straight edge to mark out where the interior ribs are, and sink a nail every 6 inches or so down these ribs. The next day I framed in this little section of angled wall that connects down from the deck up to the roof. And I installed the 2 electrical boxes that are going to be needed. One double gang for the 2 light switches, and then one just standard outlet on the back side of the building. Now in most builds it'd be time to sheet the walls, but I'm actually building this a little bit unconventionally, so I'm putting on the house wrap just straight over top of the framing. I'm just using a 3-foot roll because it's easier to manage as one person, and just overlapping the layers starting from the bottom and working my way up. I'd use some blue tuck tape just to tape down any vertical seams, and then I cut out the openings for the doors and windows. Now around the back and the sides, I just have these siding plywood panels that are usually used on sheds and stuff like that. But I actually used this on my doghouse around this time last year, and for 50 bucks a sheet, this stuff actually looks really good once you paint it whatever color you want, and it's held up to the elements pretty well. It's also a really quick way to side a building this size. I did all of this in probably 2 or 3 hours. So these panels actually eliminate the need for me to put on any sheathing underneath this, and they get installed pretty much in the same way you would install a plywood sheathing, with a few key differences. First, I used an outdoor paintable caulking just to give this sheet a good caulk before the next sheet gets lapped over top. And then I nailed these sheets into place just using my 15 gauge nailer instead of my framing nailer, so that I didn't have so many indents from big nail heads. These nails will be a little less structurally secure than framing nails, but this is a pretty small building, so I'm not worried about it, but keep that in mind. Now I don't love how the wall is quite a bit narrower than the roof, especially once the roof gets added on top of this, so I'm going to work on adding some furring strips just to bulk up this width of the wall. So I just ripped some cedar 2x4s with my table saw. And then nailed them onto the existing studs. Then I cut up a sheet of siding, and that made that wall about 1.5 inches thicker, which should look a lot better once it's all trimmed up. Now before I side this last wall, I've got to remove the sill plate from the door. So I just used my multi-tool to cut through the 2x4 until it popped out. And then I have this flashing tape that I'm just going to go around the sides of the door with, just to stop any water that leaks in through the trim of the door. With all the panels installed, I just took that same paintable caulking and just filled in all the nail holes. And I gotta say, I've been down the depths of the internet, but I've never seen so many holes filled by black caulk before. And then I have some exterior paint, and I'm just gonna paint up all these siding panels. I did 2 coats of this paint, and that gave me a really nice even sheen and a good protective coat on top of this wood siding. Now it's time to install my 3 big windows. So first I have some of this just regular cedar deck board, and it's about 1 inch thick, so I'm just ripping some 1 inch wide sections just to give me some squares. Then I sanded all 4 sides of these squares with some 120 grit. Then I also have these 1x6 cedar planks, and I'm just taking these over to the back of my shop, and then I'm going to give them a finish in some of this high heat spray paint. I wasn't sure what to paint this with, but I decided to go with high heat just because the sauna does get up to probably 90 or 100 degrees Celsius, and I'm not sure what other paints will produce any off-gassing. This high heat spray paint is safe for wood stoves and interior use, so I'm sure it should be fine for off-gassing in a sauna. But who really knows? I've never built a sauna before, and I'm just doing stuff that makes sense in my head. Next I took some flashing tape, and I'm just going to flash around the bottom and both sides of the window opening. I'm kind of just making up my own installation method for these windows, and I'm not really sure if it's correct or not, so this flashing should protect the framing from any water that gets through my mistakes I'm about to make. Now my painted boards have dried up, so I'm just cutting 1 piece to the width of the sill of the window. And then I have some of these tongue and groove blocks that I just cut off the boards that are going to be installed here. And this will just give me the spacing that I need to set this windowsill at to be flush with the paneling I put on the outside here. And then I just used some silicone to lay 2 good beads along this flashing. On the outermost bead, I actually left a couple gaps in it just so if any water does get in here, it can escape to the outside and not the inside. Then I just nailed the board into place using some 15 gauge nails. Then I did the same thing on the top and then the sides. For pretty much all 3 of these boards, I just laid 2 full beads of silicone. I didn't do any gaps. The only exception was right at the bottom of the 2 sides. I just left a little gap for water to drain out. With those boards in place and waterproofed to what I think will work, I use my combination square just to set a set line for the inner trim. Then I took one of those 1 inch square pieces I made up and cut it to the width that I need. And then I laid a bead of silicone along the inside of that alignment line and nailed this board into place. Now that inner trim is pretty much ready to accept the window, so let's bring it in. So I have these 26 by 72 insulated glass units that I had made up by a somewhat local company in Toronto. These have 1/4 inch tempered glass, 2 panels of it, and then a 1/2 inch space between them. So before I can put this insulated unit in place, I just have to do a little bit more silicone work. And I just laid a nice bead right along the seam of this trim, and then 1 more bead along the face of this trim so that the window will suck up against this. And I did the same thing around the whole window. And with a few spacer blocks along the sill, I lifted the window into place. Then I just started installing the exterior trim in the exact same way. For this bottom piece of trim, I want to cut in a couple weep holes just to let water out of the window cavity. So I just used a couple passes with a circular saw just to notch in these gaps that'll let water out. Now any water that comes down the face of the window and does manage to make it in behind the trim can escape out these weep holes. Then for the side pieces, I first just shim that window snug. And then did the same thing with 2 beads of silicone and nailing the trim into place. Like I said, I really don't know if this is the proper way to do this or not, but I can't think of any reason why this wouldn't work, and I'm pretty confident in the siliconing I did. But that's a fully installed window. Now just install the other one and we're ready to move on. So while I'm at this, I might as well install the door. And this is just a door I picked up from a local sauna supply place, and it saved me a few days of having to build this myself. So basically, I'm just sliding the door into the rough opening and tacking it up against the 1 2x4. And then I'm just shimming the other side using some door shims until that gap is pretty much even around the whole door and everything opens and closes nicely. With everything functioning properly, I just added in a few thin strips of wood as a door stop. And then I just cut away the shims and filled in any of the gaps with some expanding foam. A little later on, I also added on the door handle using some wood glue and some deck screws. So now I'm going to start installing the cedar paneling on the soffit and this front wall. But before I do that, I'm just running some of this household 14-2 wire up through the soffit to the points where all my soffit lights are going to be. So I started this run of wire at the switch box, and then I drilled holes through the rafters to run the wire where I needed it to go. I marked out where the lights were going to be, and everywhere I had that I just left this loop of wire that I just tucked up in the rafters for now, and when I cut through the soffit, this will be easy to pull down and install the light. So for the soffit and this front wall, and actually the entire interior, I'm using this 3/4 inch tongue and groove clear cedar paneling. To install this is pretty easy. First, obviously, every board gets cut to length. And then each board just slides onto the tongue of the previous board before it. Then I just sink a nail into the tongue on an angle like this every time it overlaps a stud. And when the next board goes into place, it completely covers up this nail and you don't see any exposed fasteners. I gave every board a quick sanding with some 120 grit before it goes up because it's a lot easier to do this on the ground. I'd also sink some extra nails into the face of these boards, anywhere that I knew was going to get covered up by fascia or trim or whatever. And that's a damn good looking soffit. To trim any boards with weird edges like this angled wall, I just set the boards in place and then trace the edge on the backside. And then I'd use the track jig for my circular saw just to cut along that line. And the rest of this paneling along the wall gets installed in the exact same way as I just did the soffit. This was probably the most satisfying few hours of work I've done on this so far, because it went from looking like something completely unfinished to a pretty cool looking sauna shed thing. Notice I tried to keep track of the boards and match the alignment so that the soffit flowed right down into this front wall. Now to install the soffit lights, I have a 4 1/4 inch hole saw bit. And I'm just cutting out this nice little cookie. Then I'm not going to explain how to install a light because there's a million videos that do that, but basically I cut that hoop of wire and then stripped each end. And then I just connected these wires in the junction box, all the blacks together, all the whites together, and all the greens together. Then this light just pops into place. I picked these lights specifically because they have two functions. It has the full on function, and then if you turn off the switch for 1 second and turn it back on, it switches to this halo light effect. The halo is more of an ambient light, and I think that'll look really nice with the sauna once it's all done. Now I'm going to make up all the trim for the outside, and I have my planer here, and I'm just planing these same tongue and groove boards down a little bit just for some thinner trim. After 3 or 4 passes, I could get the thickness down to about 1/2 inch, and that's what I'm going to have my trim at for no reason other than I guess I just wanted to do a bunch of extra work. With a bunch of boards ran to the right thickness, I just ran them through my circular saw to the width I wanted them at. And now I have some good square trim pieces to start going around this window. So after making some 45-degree cuts on these pieces, I can start installing them around the window, and I just use my 15-gauge nailer to tack these into place, and then I'll fill these holes later. I also have some painted black pieces of cedar that I'm going to use to cap the inside of this window frame just to make it look like all one unit. And just like all the tongue and groove pieces I did earlier, I sanded these pieces before they went up because it's a lot easier to do this before they're installed on other boards. And then I just started trimming my way around. I did the door with the same width of trim as the window, which is about 2 1/8 inch. And around this outside corner, I used 2 pieces and then glued them together with some wood glue and just brad nailed each piece in place. Then I ripped up these thin 1/2 inch pieces, and then these are going around all these inside corners and anywhere there's a transition. Then before I cleaned up all this sawdust, I just took a little and put it in a cup, and then mixed it with some wood glue until it turned into this paste. Then I can use this as my wood filler to fill in any of the holes that the nailer left. Then after a couple hours that can be sanded off, and that looks a lot better than the open nail holes. While I had the sander out, I just went around and sanded all the trim as well as the deck and anything else that needed sanding before I apply the finish. For the finish, I have this natural decking oil by a company called Livos. I decided to go with a decking oil instead of a normal deck finish you would get at Home Depot or another hardware store, because the decking oil won't chip off like these other finishes. Once this needs refinished in a couple years, you just have to reapply another coat and you don't have to do any sanding or anything, and it doesn't look terrible once it starts peeling off, because it won't. So I just applied this with a brush, and everything except for the corners I did with this big 5-inch stain applicator brush, and that saves a ton of time. You can pretty much do 1 or 2 passes and the whole board is covered. So worth $12 to pick yourself up one of these. Once the oil soaked in on a section for about 10 minutes, I'd just take some shop towels and wipe away all the excess. I did 2 coats of this finish, and now this cedar is ready for the elements. Now it's time to put on the roof, and this is the exact same standing seam roof that I put on the tiny house in my last video, and now I know how to do it so I can explain it a little better. So my first piece of trim is this drip edge, and I just squared off a line at the measurement I need and then cut it with some aviation snips. Then I took this up to the bottom edge of the roof and just aligned it flush with the edge, and then screwed it in every 18 inches or so with these pancake head screws. When I had to overlap this trim, I just opened it up a little by bending it like this, and then slipped it over the previous piece of trim with about an inch of overlap. Then I sunk another screw right through this overlap, pinning down both pieces. With that bottom drip edge on, I can now put on the underlay, so I have this blue skin membrane. This is just a really good stick down roofing underlayment that's pretty much waterproof itself. So I'd cut a sheet to rough length and then pull it up onto the roof. And once I have it all lined up, I can pull away this plastic film underneath and stick this down right onto the roof plywood. You want to start at the bottom and work your layers upwards so that it sheds water properly. And then I just trim away the excess with a knife, and I used a scrap board just to apply some pressure onto this to stick it down to the roof. With that done, I can start installing the rest of the trim, which is this F trim. So to install these side pieces, I just put it up on the corner of the roof and then just slide it up until it was right in line with the bottom edge of this drip edge. Then I'd just put in one screw just to tack this bottom in place. Then using my aviation snips, I just started making a bunch of cuts to get this little tab that I can bend over with my hammer just to close up this corner. At the top of the roof, I'd use my level and a square just to get myself a line that's right in line with the edge of the roof. And then I'd cut this off about an inch past this point and cut out these two tabs that I can bend over like so. Then for the front, I'm using the same F trim, and it can just slide right into this trim like this. For the second piece along the front, I wanted as clean of cut as I could get, so I used a cut-off wheel in my angle grinder and just cut that along a squared line. And then I just cut out this little tab so that I can overlap these two pieces. Then that just slides right into place. Some of these corners will need a little bit of caulking, but I'll do that once I'm doing the fascia. Now for these standing seam roof panels, my first panel isn't going to be full width, so I'm just measuring out its width here. And then I cut the panel about an inch wider than the width I actually need. And then I scored a line down my actual measurement. Then I used my 15-inch handbrake just to bend this up to a 90-degree angle. So that bent up portion I made slides right inside of the F trim and basically closes this off. And then each panel gets screwed down with those same pancake head screws about every 18 inches or so. And then all of these panels have this little 1-inch bent over section at the bottom, and this hooks right onto the edge of the drip edge. So on the screw inside of the panel, I just cut off this rib about 1.5 inches up. And then I made a mark on my snips here that's exactly 1 inch in, and I just lined this up with the edge of the rib and cut that back. Then I cut up the back side of the rib here just enough so I could bend this around. And then trace this and cut it out. Then I can use my mallet to bend that around nicely, and that just caps off the bottom of each rib. Then I use my handbrake just to put a little kink in these ribs to make this panel bend easier. And then I have this hand bending tool that slides over the steel an inch, and I can just bend this right around. Now this folded back section will slide right over the tongue of the drip edge and create a complete seal. Now this panel's pretty much ready to go up. I just have to measure it out to length and cut that out with a cutoff wheel of my angle grinder. So once they're all prepared, these panels are super easy to install. This taller rib just slides right over the rib of the last panel and hides the last panel's screws. This is a pretty massive roof I'm working on, so putting these panels in place took, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes. And the last panel in the run wasn't a full panel, obviously, so I just cut this to width and bent up that 1-inch tab just like I did on the first panel. And this panel has no screws to hold it in, it's just held in by friction. And that's a really nice steel roof that only cost about $500 in materials. One last thing, this ridge piece here probably should add some wider trim on it to stop water from blowing up in here. I'm not super worried about it because this is already pretty much a bulletproof roof, but I just put these foam closures in here just to stop like 99% of wind-blown water from going back in here. Now I just have the trim to do and the outside is fully done. So I have this custom trim I got made up at the same place I got the standing seam roof. And for this first U-shaped piece, I just set this in place and mark the cut lines where it runs into the soffit. And cut that out with my snips. Now I can slide that into place, and to nail this in place I'm just using some aluminum trim nails. And I'm just going down the sides like this with a nail every 2 feet or so. I also found it easier to pre-drill through the steel beforehand so that I don't bend so many nails. Now onto the fascia trim, and for these first pieces I would just mark a line at 1 inch and then just cut off this bottom portion. Then on the back side I'd score a line with my knife right along this 1 inch mark just to make this easier to bend with my handbrake up to 90 degrees. Now I can just slip this piece up underneath the drip edge and tack it in place with some more trim nails. So for a couple of these pieces I'm gonna have to cut around this vertical wall. So I transferred this measurement onto the piece of fascia and cut up just the bottom tab with my snips here. And then I used a sharp knife just to score this tab, and then I can just bend it back and forth until it pops off. And now this piece can be installed just like all the other pieces of fascia. For the side pieces I have to make some angled cuts, and I know the slope of my roof is 5 degrees, so I just marked this out with a speed square and cut that. And I found it easier to just cut both ends, and then I can just install the piece and nail it up. Now that's the outside of this sauna fully done, and I gotta say this is looking pretty damn sweet. Now let's get to the inside. Now you might have noticed in some of the other clips that I had actually already started on the inside, but doesn't matter, we're starting back at square one. So I'm first framing in basically this little tiny room that's going to be accessible from the outside and insulated from the heat of the sauna that's going to house all the electronics. So with that framed into the corner of the sauna, I have this 18 by 24 inch RV compartment door. So I'm just taking this over to the back side of the sauna and then lining it up with some measurements I made that line up with that room I just framed in. Then I just traced the outline and made a starter hole with my drill, and then cut out this line with my jigsaw. Now I have this butyl tape, and I'm just sticking this on to the inside of the flange of the compartment door. and then putting the door in place and pressing it down to get this butyl tape to stick as well as possible. Then I just pre-drilled a bunch of holes and screwed this in with some 1-inch stainless steel screws. And now that should be a fully waterproof access hatch. One more thing before I get to insulation. I'm just running some more of that 14-2 electrical wire to a receptacle and up to that double gang light switch I installed. All of these wires just run back to that utility compartment and I'll hook them up later. For insulation, I'm just using these rock wool insulation bats, and I have some for 2x4 framing and then some 2x6 framing for up in the ceiling. This stuff's pretty self-explanatory to install. You just kind of squeeze it in between the studs, and when I had to cut a piece, a really easy way to cut this is actually with a turkey carver. It's really satisfying to cut out these cubes for the electrical boxes. It's kind of like cutting out a piece of cake. So I actually only used about 4 bags of insulation for this, giving it a total cost of about $300. And now with that all insulated, I'm gonna install this foil vapor barrier the same way as I did under the floor. This special vapor barrier is a must for a sauna. You can't just use a regular plastic vapor barrier because obviously it gets really hot in here. So I just stapled that onto the studs. And then according to the directions on the vapor barrier, this red tuck tape is fine to seal up all these seams. So next I have these cedar fence boards that I'm just doing some processing on. I'm planing these down to be the thickness I need to be the furring strips behind my main cedar paneling that'll be on the interior walls. So after ripping these boards in half just to double my coverage and cutting them to length, I just started installing them. I'd just use a couple brad nails on each stud just to tack it in place, and then I'd come back with an 1.5 inch deck screw to more rigidly secure these, since it's going to be holding all the weight of the wall paneling and anything else attached to that paneling. So there's a couple reasons I need these furring strips. Number one, I want to install my paneling vertically so I wouldn't be able to attach it to the main studs. And on top of that, we need an air gap between the vapor barrier and the paneling. I'm not sure why, I just know saunas need it, so we're gonna do it. Also, just a side note, I plane these to the right thickness so that once the paneling is installed, it comes out to that exact same point as the window and door jambs and makes everything a lot easier to trim. One last thing before I get to installing the paneling, I have this 22 gauge 2-wire. And this is going to be for all the LED strip lights, but for now I'm just running these down into that electronics compartment. And then running one of these wires to every point where I'm going to have a run of lights start. I just tape these in place for now, and then once the paneling is installed, the end of the wire will just be popping out of the paneling, and I just have to solder it onto the end of the LED strip. It's also a good idea to test your wire and make sure you don't have a break anywhere, because that is completely unfixable once that paneling is installed. So I just had an extra light kicking around that I hooked up and then hooked the wire into a power source just to make sure the wire's good. And now it's right about December 15th, so I'm gonna have to start booking it to get this interior done by Christmas. So now I have the entire interior paneled in that same tongue and groove cedar paneling that I used on the exterior. I installed it in the exact same way using the same nailer as I did on the exterior, so I thought I'd just let that part be a ASMR section to try something new. So now I have these regular cedar 2x4s that are going to be the main frame for my benches. So I measured out this bench and just made it maybe an 1/8 of an inch shorter than the actual width of the wall, just so I can get this into place without scratching up the paneling. And I used a bunch more of these 2x4s as some cross members and screwed them in with some 3-inch deck screws. And then I have a bunch of these clear cedar 2x4s, and I'm just kind of arranging a pattern on the floor to get something that I think looks nice. So first I have this shorter section of 2x4, and I'm putting this right dead center in the middle of the bench. And once I've confirmed that about 20 times, I'm just using my 15 gauge nailer just to tack this in through the sides of the 2x4. Then I did the same thing at both ends. Then I just started filling in the gaps with the runs of 2x4s and the pattern that I arranged earlier. I'm just toe nailing all of these in with the same 15 gauge nailers, and I have this little piece of cut up wood that I thought was a good size spacer. So I'm just using that to space between all of the 2x4s. With all the pieces tacked into place, I just flipped this up on its side and started screwing in all those 2x4s with some 2.5-inch deck screws. Then I just gave the top of the bench a good sand up to 120 grit. And bench number 1 is ready to install. So I first just screwed some 2x4s into the wall to carry the load of the bench down to the floor. And then I just sat the bench on top of all these 2x4s. Like I said before, I made this bench about an 1/8 inch too short just so it would slide in here nicely. I added a couple more vertical supports, and then I screwed the bench itself just into the wall paneling. That's really just to hold it in place. It's not taking any of the load. Now I have these LED strip lights that are specifically designed for saunas and are good up to 90 degrees Celsius. So these come with this DC plug, but I'm going to be hardwiring these, so I'm just going to cut this off and then strip off this white wire casing. And then just strip my red and black wire so they're ready for soldering. Once I had this straight run stuck onto the bottom of my bench, I can just cut off the excess here at one of these cut points that are every couple inches. Then I used a bit of silicone just to seal up this end and make it more waterproof, and stuck it down. Now to wire in this strip, I'm just cutting back this wire I had left in the wall and then stripping the red and black. And then I'm just soldering the wires together, red to red and black to black, and covering up the connections with some heat shrink. And after connecting the wire to a power source, we have light. Next, I just built another bench the exact same way and installed another run of LED lights. Now I have this 1x6 piece of clear cedar, and I'm using this to basically cap the outside edge of this bench. This covers up the ugly bench framing and is perfectly flush with the top, and it also has about a 1/2 inch overhang at the bottom to cover up the LED lights. I didn't want to wreck the look of the clear cedar by nailing in through the front, so I went in behind this and screwed this in using some 2-inch deck screws. I also had to use a couple clamps like this and just follow along where I was screwing, just so that the screws wouldn't push out the board at all. Next, I'm cutting up one of these dark, clear 2x4s, just to make up a pattern that's a little bit different from the same cedar paneling. So I processed a bunch of wood, mostly out of 2x4s and tongue and groove panels. Until I had this nice little pattern. And then I'm just installing this on the back side of the benches just to cover up underneath. To cover up the nail holes, I found the first strip I cut off that 2x4 and it was actually like the perfect thickness and look, so I just put some glue on this and set it in place. This should probably have some nails, but I didn't want to ruin the look, so if it ever pulls off, I'll just re-glue it and nail it on.
Oh, always check if it fits.
I did the same thing along the bottom bench, even though there's a very strong likelihood in the future I'm going to have to access below these benches, and there's no way to do that, but I'll deal with that when it happens. I'm running out of time on this build. For the backrest, I had some of these off-cut pieces of 2x4 laying around, so I'm going to utilize them. So I'm just cutting this on an angle with my track saw. And then these will get mounted onto the wall, and then the backrest boards will get mounted right onto these. I also have to work an LED strip light through here, so the solution I came up with is I'm going to stick the light right on the backboard of the backrest. And then cut these slots into these pieces that'll allow that strip to pass through. So I measured out some consistent spacing and then just tack nailed these into the wall and then screwed them in rigidly. I stuck the LED strip onto the back side of this backrest board and stripped the wires. Then I set the board somewhat in place and soldered up all the wiring. And then I just nailed the backrest boards in place. And that's another task off the list. So now I'm going to be installing the tile behind where the heater's going to be. So I have this 1/2-inch aluminum tile edge. And you can actually cut this stuff with a regular miter saw blade as long as you just take it nice and slow. And then I installed this around the perimeter of where my tile is going to be. I just used some roofing nails to nail this in place. You also might have noticed earlier that I had a few boards in here that didn't fit with the design at all, since they were just regular knotty cedar, and that's because I knew this was going to be covered up with tile the whole time. So I'm going to be installing this gray colored stone mosaic tile. So first I have to mix up my tile adhesive. And then I just spread this adhesive out on the wall and scraped it evenly with a square notch 1/4-inch trowel. Then the tiles are ready to be installed. I'd use one of these full tiles wherever I could, but it really wasn't in that many areas, so other than that I would just rip the individual stones off this mesh backer and install the mosaic stone by stone. To fill in any smaller gaps, I would just break up some of the stones with a hammer and use them to fill these gaps. And now tomorrow this will be ready for some grout. So to do the grout, I'm just using this grout float and this silver colored grout I mixed up. This is a super messy job, so painter tape's your best friend on this. A roll of painter tape's like $5, and fixing any grout that gets anywhere else is gonna be a lot more than a $5 in time fix. So I just worked the grout in between all the stones and tried to scrape away as much of the excess as I could after that. And then after I let it set up for 10 or 15 minutes, I just came back with a sponge and started taking off all the extra grout. This is one of those jobs that once you start, you can't stop, and I just assumed this was going to be a couple-hour job. I kind of came here after a Christmas dinner, and I ended up being here for like 5 or 6 hours. You basically have to just keep going over and over this with the sponge and keep changing out the water until the cloudiness goes away, and I would say that's probably 10 times of washing this down. They get easier and easier as you go, but still very time-consuming. It's gonna take like 2 hours. Took like 5.5. Now that tile's looking pretty sweet, so I'm going to start doing some finishing touches and trim on the inside. All of this trim work I'm doing the exact same as the outside, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. Now I obviously need a way to make this sauna a sauna, so I have this wood-fired sauna heater from Huum, so I'm going to be installing this on top of the tile that I just laid. So I set this heater into place, and then I spent a good amount of time measuring it and getting it exactly where I needed it to poke through the roof. And then to align from the heater up to the roof, I used a laser level. And I would just shine the laser right down the center of the chimney opening and draw a tick on the ceiling. Then I did that same thing from the side angle, and now I have the center point for my chimney opening marked on the ceiling. So to drill this through, I have a long 1/4-inch drill bit, and then I have this level that I tape to my square so that I can kind of square the one angle and level the other angle, and just kind of eyeball it with the drill bit to keep this going as straight as possible so it pokes through the roof in the right spot. And then with that drilled through, I just marked out the size of my opening, which is 9 inches, and traced one of the fittings, and then cut that out with my jigsaw. Then I used that turkey carver to cut out the insulation. Now up on the roof, I did that same thing, measuring out the hole and tracing one of the fittings, and then cutting that through with my jigsaw. So now I have all these fittings that came along with the stove. They send a little bit of a variation and you don't have to use everything, so I'm just using what'll work for me. None of these have any adhesive or anything, they just kind of slip together snugly. And then with that poking through the ceiling, I can put on this pipe cover just to cover up that ugly rough cut hole. Now up on the roof, the first thing I'm doing is using some high temperature silicone and just kind of going around this seam. This isn't really to waterproof anything, it's really just to hold this chimney from wiggling around with the little bit of play it has in the rough cut hole. So to waterproof this chimney, the kit has this big stainless steel flashing, but this won't work with my standing seam roof unless I make up a bunch of trim for it, and I don't have the time for that, so I just have this common pipe boot, and I can cut this to the right size for the pipe and slide it over the chimney. Then I have some of this industrial sealant, and I'm just placing a really good thick bead around the entire perimeter of this boot. I also made sure to wipe everything down thoroughly with a microfiber cloth before to get rid of as much dust and debris as possible. With that on, I just pre-drilled some holes and then used some metal roofing screws to screw down this boot like every inch around the entire thing. By the way, this is just a regular rubber boot. I should have had a high temperature silicone boot, but I couldn't get one in time, so I'm just installing this for demonstration purposes and I'll switch it out later. But yeah, there's a good chance this is going to melt a bit. With that done, I just slid on the chimney cap and this chimney is fully installed and likely waterproof. I don't know, I really do not know what I'm doing with this part. So this stove's designed to be filled up with stones, so I just have the stones that came right from the same place as the stove. And after giving them a good rinse in a bucket that I just drilled some holes in, they're ready to fill up this cage. And now that is a pretty cool looking wood stove. So now I'm ready to pretty much finish up the inside, so I'm giving everything a good final sand with 120 grit. And then I have this natural sauna oil made by the same company that made the deck oil. This stuff gets applied pretty much in the exact same way as the deck oil, just layering it on with a good stain brush and wiping it off a few minutes later. So this step's actually fully optional, though cedar would be fine and protect it all on its own. I just really like the way the oil makes this wood look and kind of gives it that finished, deep, rich color. It also gives it a little bit of water and stain resistance, which is good, especially on the floor because there will be boots and stuff tracking in here from outside. But that's looking pretty good. That's a 99% finished interior. So now we're getting into the home stretch of this build, so first let's tackle the electrical. I have this 320 watt solar panel that I'm going to install on the roof. So first I just installed these brackets just with the hardware and bolts that came with it. Then up on the roof a while ago I drilled through these two holes and fit through these two positive and negative solar cables. And I had run those down to that same electrical components box. So now I have this rooftop cable gland thing, and I'm just feeding these wires through. Then I applied a good bead of that same sealant that I used on the boot for the chimney, and screwed this down with the provided screws. Then on the end of my two solar cables, I have to add some MC4 connections. You can get these connections just in a cheap kit on Amazon, and they're pretty self-explanatory to install. And then I brought up the solar panel and slid it into position. To mount the solar panel, I first just used a microfiber rag just to get rid of any dust under the bracket, and then I cut off a little square of this butyl tape and placed it right along the foot of the bracket. Then as an added seal, I used some more of that sealant and went around the entire perimeter and screwed through the bracket with a metal roofing screw. Then these cables can just be plugged into the cables on the panel and the roof install is complete. Now I just need something to charge. So I have this fairly large power bank I bought on Amazon with no specific brand preference. I just got a good Black Friday deal. And this will be the power source for all the electrical. So first of all, it comes with this MC4 charging adapter, so I can just plug those cables I ran through the wall from the solar panel directly into this to charge via solar. So next, to hook up the lights, the cable running into the electrical compartment is one of these 14-2 wires, and I'll just run that right into a junction box and strip back the wires. So now to connect this to the power source, I just have this regular extension cord and I'm just cutting it at the length I need. And then I'm doing the same thing, just stripping back the wires and feeding it into the junction box. And then I'm just connecting all of these wires with some wire nuts, black to black, white to white, and green to green. Then this extension cord can just be plugged into the power source, and this is now a live wire. So I took that concept and basically did the exact same thing in this electronics compartment. I have one extension cord feeding the 2 wires that go to my 2 light switches, and one feeding a receptacle that's on one of the exterior walls. To feed my LED strip lights, I need to install a transformer. So first, this is the wire coming back from the light switch. Then I have this 120 volt to 24 volt transformer. Then I'll basically just take the 3 input wires for this transformer and wire nut them onto the wire coming from the light switch. Then these 2 output wires will just get soldered on to the feed wires for the LED strips, all that 22 gauge wire I ran through the walls earlier. By the way, I'm no electrician and this is not a 100% proper way on how to install this stuff, but I'm comfortable with the risk that any of this poses. One last thing, I have the charging cable that came with the power bank, and I'm just cutting the male end off of this. Then I have this exterior plug that's designed to feed through a wall. So I'm just going to wire this charging cable into this plug and feed it through the wall, so I could just plug this whole building into an extension cord and I don't have to go into the electronics compartment at all. Now I can just bring the power bank into the compartment and plug in all the wires, and we have off-grid clean power. With all the lights running inside and out, it only uses about 100 watts of power, so this battery bank could support it for 12 hours without charging at all. So one last thing for the exterior, I'm going to make up a firewood rack that'll be sitting right on the deck here. So I'm using some of this 1-inch square steel tubing with a thickness of 0.065 inch. I'm going to cut this steel with this cheap chop saw I've had forever, and to get a perfect 45-degree angle, I'm just going to use my square to set this guide, and that'll be as close to 45 as I need for this. So I cut up a bunch of the pieces I needed, and then I used a sanding disc in my angle grinder just to make these edges a little nicer for welding. So to start welding these pieces together, I just use one of these magnetic clamps and just confirm with my square that this is pretty close. And then I'd start welding using my cheap flux core welder. This welder just plugs into a regular 120 volt wall socket, so it's nice for jobs like this. I don't have to lug around some big welder. So this rack's pretty simple. It's basically just a big rectangular prism, so I made up 2 of these big rectangles. And then I cut a bunch of these shorter pieces and welded them onto one of the rectangles and then welded the next rectangle on top. Then after grinding down the ugly welds and doing a good sanding with a 120 grit sanding disc, this rack's ready for some primer and paint. This is just some regular Tremclad rust paint and primer, nothing special about it, and I just did a couple coats of each. After this rack had dried for a few hours, I lifted it into place and then bolted it into the wall using some 1/4-inch stainless steel lag bolts. This thing could have dried a little longer. I definitely left a few fingerprints in it, but it's leaving in the morning, so time to hammer down. Now on to the last thing for this build. I only have a couple hours left to work on this, so I had a local wood shop make me up just this 36 by 36 walnut panel, and I'm going to be making this into a ceiling accent piece. I had another idea of what I was going to do here, but I don't have enough time and I can make this pretty quick, so this is going to look really nice for the video. And I know all the sauna experts are going to be commenting that walnut will never last and it'll warp and crack apart in a sauna, but hey, what's the point of doing everything right? You gotta learn some stuff for yourself. So basically I just traced on a perfect circle using that little nail and board jig I made up, and this is really only going to be a temporary piece that's going to bust apart anyway, so I'm just cutting this out as close to the line as I can with my jigsaw. Then after giving the edge a good sand with some 120 grit, I'm just putting a 1/4-inch round over on both sides. So I use my combination square just to mark an inner circle on the underside of this. And then I just have a bunch of these off-cut cedar paneling pieces that I'm just assembling in a circle. And then I'm just taking some more of that sauna LED strip and sticking it around this. Back on the front side, I'm using a 1/2-inch Forstner bit just to countersink some screw holes. I measured these holes out into a nice hexagon pattern just because they will be somewhat visible when I'm all done. And then I pre-drilled my holes and just started my screws so I don't have to do that on the ceiling. So my brother's around again because I need an extra set of hands for this, but he basically just held this while I soldered the wires, and then we just made sure all the alignment was right and screwed this right into the paneling. Over at my drill press, I cut out some 1/2-inch dowels using an off-cut piece of that walnut. And then I just put some glue in the hole and slid that dowel into place. I also used some glue and sawdust just to fill in any remaining gap. Then an hour or so later I can come back with my multi-tool and just cut the majority of this off. And after a good sand, that looks pretty slick. Now I can just apply that same sauna oil. Once again, this ceiling light probably won't last, but it looks awfully good for now. But hey, that's the last thing. This sauna is now fully done. Less than a month ago, this was still a pile of lumber in my shop, and I worked 12 hours almost every single day from then until now to get this done, but man does this look good. All it needs is just a nice snowy view. So after using it a few times, it only takes about 50 minutes to go from freezing temperature all the way up to about 70 degrees Celsius. This is much more practical than my hot tub that's also wood-fired that takes more like 5 hours to get up to hot tub temp. It also holds heat really well. The day I filmed this, I stopped stoking the fire at around 6 and we were still in the sauna at 50 degrees at 11. Overall, I'm just incredibly happy with how cool this thing looks. All the lighting, accenting, the cedar just couldn't look any better in my opinion. All in, this sauna cost about $25,000 Canadian, and almost half of that price was just the price of the clear cedar, so you could cut that down enough if you just use regular cedar. But like I said before, as this YouTube channel continues to grow, I'm going to keep building cooler and cooler stuff. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Also, if you're a real keen observer, you'll probably wonder why it's a full-on snowstorm right around this sauna, and everything in the background looks green. Well, that's because we have absolutely no snow right now, so I took this into my own hands.
Enough snow so I can make
Me and my brother spent a full night making snow just to make this video look as good as I hoped it could look. Thanks so much for watching my video. I try to make everyone as cool as it could possibly be, and I appreciate all your comments. I was hoping to have this video out right before Christmas, and it looks like I'm a couple days late, but hey, what are you gonna do? It's a lot of work for 4 weeks. Happy holidays, and until next time, thanks for watching.